Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Jeffrey, the chair of the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center, and I'm happy to welcome you all today to hear a presentation by our Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, Barbara Leaf. She'll conduct her remarks, and then we'll have a discussion moderated by another one of our colleagues from the Foreign Service. This is Old Home Week for us here today, Ambassador David Hale. Where do I begin with Barbara? Barbara and I first came together almost 20 years ago in the Near Eastern Bureau, and I always thought that someday she would rise to the top of that bureau, but I don't want to stress that because she's not going to be able to say that she thought I would rise any further than I did. So therefore, we'll relieve her of that burden. Now, many of you, I hope, have read the very important and for once, very pertinent administration national security strategy. And if you have read it carefully, you'll notice the emphasis on great power competition with Russia and with China has pride of place. The Middle East gets perhaps less attention than we who know it and love it think it does. But not to worry, because as long as the administration has put Barbara Leaf in charge of the Middle East, it will get its share of attention, believe me. Barbara is a magician in the field of diplomacy. She not only makes lemonade from lemons, she can make moonshine out of moonbeams. As I said, Barbara knows that while aircraft carriers and Patriot missiles are fine, they're in short supply, whereas energy, interpersonal relations, leadership, knowledge of the region, and all-around skills in the world of diplomacy are really the multiplier factors, and that's what Barbara has in abundance. So Barbara, once again, welcome here.
Thank you, Jim. I was quite nervous. I didn't know where you were going with those remarks, so they landed just fine. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to speak with this esteemed audience about Lebanon. And David, thank you for moderating the event. So first, a little bit of history. Over the past decade, U.S. Lebanon policy has sought to limit the threats posed by malign actors to Lebanon, bolster Lebanon's ability to protect its borders, and build state capacity to deal with the compounding crises facing the country, including the current economic crisis. But when the Biden administration took office nearly 2 years ago, Lebanon was sliding towards economic, even societal collapse, with some estimates that collapse could come as early as the end of last year. A country that had been solidly middle class was rapidly shedding the members of that class through emigration, and the society at large was sinking rapidly into poverty, including extreme poverty. The UN estimates some 82% of Lebanese live in multidimensional poverty. Some 33% now live in extreme poverty. Those are shocking figures. Lebanon's has been in extreme descent, built on decades of poor governance, economic mismanagement, and rampant corruption. That descent has only accelerated, its effects deepened by a series of black swan events: the pandemic, the port blasts, Russia's war in Ukraine. Thus, when we began a rapid policy review 18 months ago, it was clear that a bit more humanitarian aid here or there would be wholly insufficient. Shoring up Lebanon, putting a floor beneath the prospect of collapse, became the imperative to give Lebanon's own leaders the space and time to tackle a series of critical tasks, not least of which was forming a fully empowered government. That task is still outstanding, and more on that in a moment. So the Biden administration laid out a series of objectives and identified tools to pursue them. Press urgently for government formation. Support the most vulnerable elements of the public. Support the quest for an IMF package built on critical reforms. Support 2 energy deals proffered by regional partners, Jordan and Egypt, to get Lebanon out of its crippling inability to provide the public the energy it needed. Bolster the resilience of Lebanon's armed forces and internal security forces, which have taken on greater and greater burdens beyond sustaining public order and security. And yet again, press Lebanon's political leaders for urgent action on their part, in both doing their part in the reforms necessary for the IMF and World Bank arrangements, and most importantly, in forming a permanent, empowered government. On government formation, let me just remind you, it took Lebanon's leaders nearly 14 months to form a proper government after the August 2020 port blast. We and other like-minded partners spent much of last year pressing Lebanon's party leaders to move beyond a weak, disempowered caretaker government. On assistance, the U.S., as you know, is Lebanon's largest international donor of foreign assistance, having provided $5.3 billion since 2006, including more than $778 million in FY 2021 alone, funding which has also included humanitarian assistance for Syrian refugees and host communities. And so far in FY 2022, the U.S. has provided nearly $294 million in humanitarian assistance for vulnerable populations in Lebanon and for Syrian refugees. On the loans, Lebanon's best prospect for getting out of the spiraling economic crisis is through an IMF loan and restoring international confidence by enacting long overdue reforms to access the $3 billion that's on the table now. Parliament and the government are making creeping progress on the requirements. Some of the critical measures required: bank sector reform and setting the country on a path towards debt sustainability. On the energy deals, Egypt and Jordan have each stepped forward to provide the pathway to getting Lebanon's people the energy to sustain daily life, businesses, medical care, the economy itself. Lebanon's public utility currently manages only 2 to 3 hours of electricity a day. The natural gas deal engineered by Egypt and Jordan and the proposal by Jordan to provide excess electricity to Lebanon could add an additional 6 to 8 hours of power a day for Lebanon. On support for the LAF and the ISF, these institutions have been at the forefront of responding to Lebanon's compounding crises, taking on humanitarian and public safety functions far beyond their traditional remit, even as crime and instability are on the rise. Strong, stable security institutions such as the LAF and ISF undermine Hezbollah's assertion that its arms are necessary to defend Lebanon from external aggression. The LAF and ISF are two of the most functional, trusted, and viable state institutions in Lebanon. But both institutions are currently facing enormous strains due to a lack of basic resources, and they're struggling to maintain core operations. That the LAF and ISF persisted in their duties, even as their budgets and salaries plummeted by 95%, is a tribute to their commitment and professionalism. They can't afford to fail, lest the state itself collapse. The administration has not only ensured a steady stream of bolstered in-kind assistance, we've taken the unprecedented step of arranging for direct salary assistance, limited in time, but critical to sustaining the forces as they struggle to meet their own families' needs and find fuel to get to work. We've also successfully encouraged other states, Qatar in particular, to undertake this drastic measure. As Ambassadors Hale and Jeffrey know all too well, Lebanon has faced many crises over the years, and its political class has always found a way to muddle through, avoiding the tough decisions while staving off collapse. But this has come at a cost. Lebanon's once vaunted institutions are now hollow. Its markets have collapsed, and the bill has come due, creating what the World Bank has described as possibly one of the top 3 worst economic and financial meltdowns in the past 150 years. And it is the Lebanese people who are paying the terrible price. The economic crisis is not only the result of poor governance, it's a product of systemic corruption and mismanagement that has plagued Lebanon for decades. And we're under no illusion that things will change overnight. Now to government formation, where I started. The end of President Aoun's term and his departure on October 31st leaves Lebanon in an unprecedented political vacuum, without either a president or an empowered cabinet. I can only judge how wholly unacceptable the situation is to the public. It's a stark abrogation of responsibilities by the parliament, the people's elected representatives. So let me be clear, with all the goodwill, all the effort and money and stopgap measures proffered by Lebanon's friends, the US, France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and other regional and European states, we cannot substitute for the urgent, irreplaceable tasks that are the responsibility squarely of Lebanon's parliament and political leaders. Lebanon urgently needs a president, and just behind that, a prime minister who will take up with the president, forming a fully empowered cabinet that will get to work on the decisions, including key reforms that underwrite the IMF loan and the prospective World Bank loans for the energy deals. Nothing we or any other foreign partner can do can take the place of what Lebanon's own political leaders have failed to do to date: form a government and get to the urgent task of pulling Lebanon back from the brink. The U.S. is ready to work with that government on all of the critical pieces of the crisis enveloping Lebanon, but we must have a fully empowered government to do its part, above all in tackling key economic reforms. I'm mindful of the narrative in some parts of this town and elsewhere that letting Lebanon collapse may somehow enable it to rebuild from the ashes, free of the plague that Hezbollah has represented for so many years. If only it were so simple, but it's not. Lebanon's people and its neighbors, Jordan, Israel, the Syrian people, would bear the brunt of state collapse. So our efforts are aimed precisely at averting that scenario, while putting pressure on those whose job it is to govern the country. But let me be clear. We are clear-eyed about the threat Hezbollah continues to pose to Lebanon, the U.S., Israel, and the region, and will continue to use the range of tools at our disposal to undercut that threat. Now, in this otherwise dark picture, I'd be remiss if I did not highlight a bright spot, and that's the resolution of the Israeli-Lebanon maritime boundary dispute on October 27th. Ambassador Hale himself invested many years of work on this tremendously difficult file and knows what a diplomatic milestone this represents. As President Biden so rightly said, this agreement protects Israel's security and economic interests, critical to promoting its regional integration. It provides Lebanon the space to begin its own exploitation of energy resources, and it promotes the interests of the U.S. and the American people in a more stable, prosperous, and integrated Middle East region, with reduced risks of new conflicts. Persistent U.S. diplomacy, paired with an irreplaceable ingredient, the political will of Israeli and Lebanese leaders to negotiate, consult, and ultimately choose what was in the best interests of their people. That led to this breakthrough. And it's now critical that all parties uphold their commitments and work towards implementation. This agreement only underscores that difficult things can be done with the necessary political will. That's the critical, still missing ingredient. That and a sense of urgency on the part of Lebanon's political class, its parliament, its political party leaders. So I'm actually a tiny bit optimistic, notwithstanding. The Maritime Agreement was a very big step for a country technically in a state of war with Israel. This agreement demonstrates the Lebanese government and its political leaders can act for the good of its people when there is will to do so, even with a very tough set of decisions. And while this agreement will not solve all of Lebanon's problems, and it's not a substitute for much needed reforms, it certainly underscores that its leaders can govern and make more tough decisions. Lebanon is a country of enormous beauty, its people of surmounting talent and culture. They deserve a government, and they certainly deserve a much, much brighter future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. And I add to Jim's warm welcome of you here at the Wilson Center. Brooke will be available to take questions from the audience. I think there's some index cards around, so if you please write down your questions, she'll be gathering them and we can pose them to you. But while the audience thinks about that, I'd like to maybe dig a little bit deeper on the central question you raised about in order to get to the financial reforms and the relief that the international community can provide, as you rightly said, the institutions and the people of Lebanon need to get their act together and select a president and get a government formed. Unfortunately, we know from history that that often just doesn't happen because of the complexities and sharpness of disputes in the country, and often it's been an international intervention that has led to solutions to these crises. Not always very happy solutions, I might add. So while I understand our role is to stand apart from that, maybe you could elaborate a bit on scenarios that you see in the months ahead.
So I wouldn't say we stand apart from that because, as you know, David, so much of our work is the cajoling, the pushing, the pressing, the long, long nights of discussions and discussions over, be it particular reform pieces or the complex of political decisions in front of them. That takes place for the most part outside of the limelight. And that is the kind of work we're involved in. And the French have done this at different intervals. The Saudis stepped back, but I think will step back in. I think you probably know better than any single person, certainly in the wider U.S. think tankery universe, that complex interlocking of plays. And I think if I recall correctly, it took 2 years of spoiled ballots for the parliament to elect Michel Aoun. The thing is, yes, there have been dire times before, but there is nothing like the situation now. So I can see scenarios where there is disintegration, that's the worst, where there's just an unraveling, where 6 months of salary payments to the LAF and the ISF and all the sort of stopgap measures we can throw at it, they lose control of things, there's mass migration, so forth. I mean, you can think of a lot of catastrophic scenarios, and I somehow imagine a lot of these same parliamentarians packing their bags and going off to places in Europe or elsewhere where they have property. That's sort of the darkest end of the spectrum. I think there are many other scenarios in between, but it is not really the work of foreign diplomats to get on the parliamentary floor and get them to make the deal that will unlock the presidency. I frankly think things will have to get worse before the public pressure mounts in such a way that they feel that. We are putting pressure directly on political leaders to do their work, but there's nothing like the pressure of the public, and sooner or later that will boil up again, and it's the worst sort of pressure that politicians can face. But frankly, as I said, going through my remarks, we have identified all sorts of measures to buttress things, but we can't do that internal work.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. So if we do get to a point where we have a president in Lebanon and there is a government that is committed to reforms, can you expand a bit on what we expect in terms of specific reforms and how the United States can help along with our partners in the international community, financially and otherwise?
Yeah, so, there is the $3 billion loan program, the IMF program. I had my folks pull up and do a cheat sheet of sort of the 8 pieces that are required to get that done. It's passed from the staff discussions, and now it's really in the hands of the cabinet, the parliament, central bank. They have finished 4 of the 8 pieces. But if you don't have a fully empowered cabinet, it's hard to see how you get through the rest of it. On the World Bank energy deals, and this is the subject, again, of regular, if not daily, the discussions between our mission and the various parts of the government, and certainly other foreign missions, pushing and abjuring them to move on and get this done. The energy deals, the cabinet has not approved. There are sort of 2 basic elements for the World Bank to sort of certify that they're ready to do the loan, and then the Department of Treasury has to look at it in terms of any sanctions issues. But they've got to do the kind of transparency reforms in the electricity sector, which are frankly going to gore a lot of oxen. So there is resistance, and that resistance just has to be ground down, because the so-called rescues, Iranians bringing in tankers of oil, all that gets smuggled and does not get to the power grid. So it's daily, relentless work.
Yeah. Well, this goes to excellent point you made about corruption. It's not just poor governance, but deep-seated corruption.
Banking sector, putting transparency into that sector is so long overdue, and it's exactly what people don't want.
Yeah. By the way, I should have welcomed Sheikh Baha Hariri as well, who's joined us here in the audience. Again, we'd welcome questions from anyone, but while Brooke is gathering those, we might turn for a moment to the Maritime deal, just expand perhaps on that. What's next? What's the timeline, if there is one that can be predicted at this point, for when we will have a sense of what's in store for Lebanon, if there is gas? And what controls you might be thinking about encouraging the Lebanese to adopt in order to preserve this?
So on the one hand, it's a pretty clean and simple arrangement. The papers were signed, they were witnessed by the U.S., and they have been deposited with the UN. And so let the games begin. On either side of the line, both countries are free to explore and exploit the resources. Obviously, Israel is well ahead in that sense. Lebanon's own resources are just guessed at. There's been, as far as I know, no detailed mapping of what resources lie beneath the waves. But the fact that you now have that stability and security proffered by that invisible line means that you can attract international firms in to do that exploration work. Now, that's not going to be a next year, a year after kind of dividend return. And there's some mistaken belief, I think, among those precisely who don't want to see the reforms of the banking sector or the electricity sector. There's this notion, well, we don't need this mere $3 billion loan because we've got all that natural gas out there. But the fact is, that's years worth of work to explore and determine what's marketable, what's commercially feasible, then to execute. So that won't be tomorrow's work. It's great, but it's not money in the bank yet.
And when I was there, I was always raising the point also that not only is the money not in the bank, but if it does get to the bank, we want to make sure it's safe there.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, there are lots of ideas about that. Look, I mean, the countries I've served in, I'm sure many of the countries you've served in have sovereign wealth funds. That's one way that you do, that you husband your resources and use it for the long game of developing your country, and, whether it's the fund for future generations or what have you. So there are a number of mechanisms for safeguarding those precious resources and making sure that they go to the public good.
Yeah, very good. Now, we all know that Lebanon has suffered greatly from the spillover of the ongoing civil conflict in Syria in many, many ways, including, of course, an unprecedented flow of refugees. Last time I checked in, a quarter of the Lebanese population living in Lebanon were Syrian refugees, which is just unprecedented.
Yes.
Perhaps you could, I know you didn't have a chance in your prepared remarks, but maybe you could elaborate.
Yeah, no, look, we're very conscious of the fact of the burden that hosting and securing and taking care of people who have been chased from their homes, what that poses on a very small state like Lebanon, and one moreover that is deeper and deeper into its own crisis. All that said, the U.S. has been generous in working to mitigate and to assist. I think we have done something on the order of $2 billion in assistance for the support that is rendered to refugees in Lebanon since 2012, and we'll continue that work directly and through UN mechanisms. But I do want to say a word about the rhetoric that we've heard recently, the sort of anti-refugee rhetoric, and this publicly expressed desire to simply send them home. Nothing would make me happier than to see conditions created, developed in Syria by the Syrian government that would allow people to go home. But the one thing we cannot stand by and tolerate is governments forcing people out, engaging in refoulement. So we will continue to do our part. Other donors will do their part. But we don't want to see Syrians who themselves are in an extraordinarily fragile and vulnerable situation in Lebanon pushed back to something still more perilous.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why international support for the refugees is so important, and for the Lebanese communities that are hosting them.
It is.
Well, we all know that Lebanon is a mirror of the Middle East, and while we're here to talk about Lebanon, we can't ignore how some of these dimensions play out. And you're not here, I know, to talk about JCPOA's future, but I would like to ask you to talk a bit about Hezbollah and how it's linked to our Iran policy.
So look, I mean, I would almost say that Hezbollah stands, apart and in its own right, apart from our Iran policy, because of the nature of the weight and the sort of the predatory nature that it imposes upon Lebanon, and the parallel state that it represents in a sense, and the lack of accountability to any Lebanese leader. So in its own right, it poses threats. It poses threats to us, to the neighborhood, to Lebanese themselves. And we have continued our work on sanctioning and designating and squeezing networks connected to Hezbollah, whether in the region or elsewhere. On Iran, I would just say, I mean, you've seen comments by senior U.S. officials recently that are, to say the least, are a very vivid reminder of where our attention is. Our attention is on the protests in Iran and really the extraordinary brutality with which the regime is chasing down young women, young men, children in the street. Let's remember this started 4 weeks ago with a 22-year-old woman being beaten to death, essentially, by the so-called morality police, for the crime of a bit of her hair straying from out from under her hijab. It's generated this explosive, this volcanic level of public anger, and anger on the part of women in particular, that I think this regime has a very difficult time understanding or contending with. Sad to say, it's not turned the worst of its security forces yet upon the public. It could still do worse. But our focus really is on calling out and supporting lifting up the voices of Iranian women and others who support them in their quest. We have a number of programs that are global in nature that support internet access, free flow of information. I will say, as much as the regime does turn on and off and disrupt the internet and internal flows of information, it has not had an effect. It has not been able to dampen.
Stopped.
Yeah, exactly. So Iranians are getting their information, they are sharing it, and they're mobilizing. Now, where that goes, it's very difficult to see, but is certainly, by any judgment, the most serious unrest of an organic nature that the regime has seen since the revolution itself. And you notice I didn't say anything about the JCPOA because it is just not front and center these days.
Important point to take home. Well, the U.S.-Saudi Arabian relationship, of course, has been a key pillar for our strategy toward Lebanon. Our work together historically has done a lot to promote our friends and counter our foes. The relationship is going through a stressful period, and I wondered if you could perhaps elaborate on how you see that reflected in Lebanon.
It's not affecting our work on Lebanon. Look, the relationship has gone through, a period of strain. That's been very publicly aired, and in a way that, I think, let me put it this way. I went through the Gulf 10 days ago, and the degree to which the Saudis and we aired our public differences unsettled people. But it was a real divergence of approach on a key issue: stability of oil markets, stability of supply, and engendering stability of price on a global level, not just for the U.S., but of course for the U.S. We had a real divergence of view, and what I can say is we still have a commonality of strategic interests. And dealing with the very fragile, vulnerable state of this region, countries like Lebanon, countries like Yemen remain front and center for us. And so they are a field of collaboration for us, notwithstanding.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear. My last question, I prepared in advance anyway, is on the Abraham Accords. And whether in any way you see a connection between the breakthroughs that were achieved under that initiative and the Maritime Agreement, or if there's another normalization chapter ahead of us that could include Lebanon.
Yeah. So it's a really good question that I haven't been able to answer myself. It just felt that somehow the stars aligned in both places, in Lebanon and Israel. And you've been through this in past years. Come close, but not close enough, wide divergences over where the line should settle, hectoring and threatening rhetoric from Nasrallah, as he did only a month or so ago, and just seemingly an intractable set of requirements on either side.
I can't really tell you what the magic was, but stars aligned in such a way that a relentless and methodical negotiator like Amos Hochstein could really drive them to close the difference. And it may just be that there was an acute sense in both places. In Lebanon, I think it's fair to say that people, that those in the government had begun to appreciate what an opportunity cost it had been to them and an actual loss of revenues in the last decade that they had never come to agreement. And while Israel had gone ahead and done much of the exploration on its side, but the Israelis very much wanted the security and stability of a known line so that there would no longer be these verbal and then other sorts of exchanges. So does this lead the way towards a land border, towards normalization? Not so much. And they were careful to say that this maritime discussion did not presage or preview something on the land border. I would say the larger kind of movement of, the two new relationships, UAE, Bahrain, the resumption of Moroccan-Israeli relations, frankly, the pretty transparent way that two countries in the Gulf, Oman and Qatar, deal with the Israeli government, notwithstanding they have no formal relations. There is a bit of a changing landscape, in part. Maybe that had an indirect, but I think it was as much that both sides saw clear economic interests that were at risk.
Very good. Well, I would just add, since I'm retired, I can speak more freely than before, is that I think it'll be very important for the friends of Lebanon, including the United States that were involved in this deal, to do everything we can to make sure no one faction, no one element, and no one economic interest benefits, but it truly benefits the people of Lebanon. So we have some questions from all of you, and I will start with, since there are so many from the Lebanese diaspora who are in fact represented here and online, what is the role of the Lebanese diaspora in supporting Lebanese civil society?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think from having spoken with members of many different diasporas over the years, kind of depends on whether you are free, how closely you tend to those connections back home, and do you have the ability to go back home? I mean, that's a major difference for the Lebanese versus the Iranian diaspora. Can you go back, and can you have enough impact? Do you have the financial means that you can support entrepreneurs or civil society organizations back home? I talked to a group of civil society leaders, young leaders that we brought to the United States the other day through one of our programs. They'd spent, I think, 2 months in the United States just refining their leadership skills, giving them general civic education, taking them to see state and local government, not sort of saying this is your model, but saying this is a model, but look at how our civil society feeds life in the United States. And when I spoke to them after my remarks, the point I made over and over again that whether they're a young entrepreneur, somebody who is doing leadership training of their own, whether they're an activist, advocate of some kind, whether they work in the human rights domain, civil society, the health and strength and resilience of civil society in every country goes to the strength of and resiliency of that state, of that society. So how you feed it, I think, depends on whether you are able to go back. You can provide some funding for things there. Funding is one of the dearest things right now to sustain advocates and those who work in nonprofits and those who do public services that the government has failed and cannot carry out. So there are myriad ways, whether it's advocacy on the behalf of the vulnerable or there's providing services that are just not there.
Thank you, Barbara. I would just add also that I think the Lebanese American community is enormously powerful, and
Yes.
When we're an echo chamber where the embassy and the State Department and the community and members of Congress who care about Lebanon speak with one voice, it really is a powerful message. You talked about civil society just now, and another question is, how are women and youth affected, in particular by the crises in Lebanon? And I would add also, what are we doing to empower those elements of society?
So women and young people across the Middle East in crisis-ridden societies or in conflict-ridden societies are often those who are most vulnerable or most at risk of losing a precious moment in their time and their development. So, you're a 20-year-old in Libya, you're a 20-year-old in Tunisia, which is another example of a country that was only a few years ago a pretty solidly little middle-class society, maybe not high middle class, but solidly middle to lower middle class, and they are in a catastrophic period, and they are bleeding young people. When I was there 2 months ago and talked to an entrepreneur, she said, we are providing feedstock to Europe with all of our young engineers. They graduate and they go immediately to Europe. So when a country is in real economic crisis, young people, if they can, they start looking to leave. And what do they find on the other side? Maybe they can never get beyond, maybe they never break into the white-collar profession they wanted or are able to pursue their dreams as an immigrant or as an illegal migrant to a country. So they're stymied at just a critical point in their own development. Women, of course, across the Middle East, have very low levels of participation in the job market. And that's in stable countries as well as more crisis-ridden countries. So we have programs that even in crisis in Lebanon are directed exactly those communities.
Terrific. I was always struck by the reality that in the Middle East, Lebanon actually is one of the bottom of the list countries in terms of representation of women in public office, which is odd given the high level of education
Yes.
of women historically there. The sectarian system may have something to do with that.
Yeah.
You identified corruption as a very critical element here and a central obstacle to progress. What is the United States doing to combat that?
So, the kind of, we have programs, of course, but we also have the pressure vehicles, if you will, of these important deals that are out there that are critical to the next phase of Lebanon's. It's not so much development, it's pulling itself back from the brink. These are actually, they're both life-saving in terms of offering critical loans that will themselves open up other financing, but also, again, providing energy to fuel an economy that is barely functioning. They come with strings, and those are really important strings. So those are drivers in themselves for, that's not the original purpose, but those are vehicles for reforms. There's also the day in, day out work that we do and the sanctioning work that where we see apt targets for corruption.
The global Magnitsky
Yeah.
Act sanctions. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very good. Here's an interesting question because it raises an idea that we don't always talk about in American policy toward Lebanon is the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
And are there sectors that we should be encouraging the private sector and the international community to be investing directly in Lebanon despite all of the risks?
Yeah, that's a hard one. That's a really hard one. And, I have in my prior work on Iraq and a few other countries, but just to take Iraq as an example, which for all of its, its conflict and political crises and so forth over the course of 20 years, it's got vast resources, it's got vast opportunities, and yet, it's got a frightful business environment. So does Lebanon. And it's in the middle of this terrible crisis. So it's hard for me to say, honestly, that I can point to a given sector where, there's gold in them, our hills, as the saying goes. We do commercial advocacy work, of course, but right now, Lebanon has got to make itself a more attractive environment by doing these really critical first reform steps.
Mm-hmm.
And getting electricity. I mean,
Yeah. Right. The
beyond
basics.
2 hours a day.
Yep. So we know that in the parliamentary elections earlier this year, that we had a strong showing compared to previous years for independent MPs.
Yes.
Maybe you could elaborate on that. And the question I received from the audience is, how can the U.S. support those MPs that won in May?
So that's where I see that diaspora, civil society, U.S. and other partners all coming together. So yes, it was a very interesting showing. We had a similar thing. Once again, I'm going to refer to Iraq just because there are certain. It's not so much they're not similar systems, but it was interesting that in both elections this year, you had an unusually strong showing of independence in systems that are otherwise pretty weighted towards these blocs and these political parties of longstanding. So we do a lot of work to support and help independence thrive. It's engagement. It's offering opportunities to go to the United States for again leadership training and engagements like that. We certainly look to bring visitors out to Lebanon and meet with them and give them access to the kind of exposure to figures in our system who can talk with them on an expert level about some of the issues that they have to deal with as politicians. And of course, just as in the Congress, you run a campaign the first time you enter into the halls of a parliament and you realize you've got all this statecraft to deal with and you don't actually have the expertise. You're a politician, but you don't know anything about water systems or public services for your constituency or. So you have to get smart. And so we have programs there that we offer.
Excellent. There's another question about Ukraine and its relationship to Lebanon and how what's happening in Ukraine affects Lebanon. And I might, if you permit me, expand the question a little bit, because the issue of the future power of Russia and the Russian leadership is obviously something that's unfolding and will have consequences in the Middle East and in the Levant. So over to you.
So look, I mean, the thing that was really the thing that really captured my attention, in the days after February 24th, was the degree to which so many countries in the Middle East relied predominantly on wheat and other commodities from Ukraine and or Russia. So Tunisia, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, all of them were immediately vulnerable. Some countries, Jordan was one of them, had been listening, I would say, to the public warnings the administration began to articulate going back to last November, December, warning of this buildup that looked quite ominous, that really had no logical reason for it other than either a coercive kind of military diplomacy on Putin's part or a possible intention to move in on Ukraine. So some countries heard that and did some stockpiling. But even those countries which stockpiled, all of these countries in the Middle East have been battered by the effects, the inflationary effects from energy and other commodities. So what does it mean for Russia in the Middle East? It's a very good question, and there's not a short answer. I think a lot of governments in the Middle East have wanted to view Russia's war on Ukraine as that distant European war, except that you have to go back to World War II to see a war have global implications in the way that this one has had. I mean, it tipped food insecure countries in Africa onto the brink of famine, just like that. And it could undermine the stability of a country like Tunisia. Is blame assigned then to Russia? Unfortunately, not so much. I think people again like to think of this in sort of a compartmentalized way, that this is some quarrel between Russia and Ukraine. It has nothing to do with us, and they ought to solve it diplomatically. We're not. I don't see any prospect for it being solved diplomatically anytime soon, and that's because Putin's requirements of Ukraine are zero-sum. They have not moved from where they were in February. And so with that sort of prospect, I think, that is, it's hard to blame Ukraine for fighting for its survival, let alone trying to recapture as much of its territory as it can. I would have thought that Russia's assistance to Bashar al-Assad to effectively destroy much of a really glorious country would have altered public thinking about Russia. It hasn't. So I think over time, my educated guess would be, the ability of Russia to retain military presence in the Middle East will be progressively strained by the war. But they will do their best to keep the footprint in Syria, to keep a footprint on the Mediterranean through Libya as well. But I think the ability to do the kind of adventurism that Putin engaged in so robustly in 2015 to 2019 will be much curtailed.
Mm-hmm. We, of course, see a material alliance between Iran and Russia as well in terms of the conduct of the war. So this is kind of a provocative question, but it was asked, so I think it's important to say this, and I also know there are Lebanese many Lebanese who view the issue of the Maritime border agreement through this lens, so I think it's important for you to respond to it if you can. And this is the question, after the demarcation of the maritime border between Lebanon and Israel with USA, is the USA going to continue collaboration with Hezbollah? The premise being that Hezbollah was a key component in reaching the agreement.
Hezbollah was not a key component of the agreement. As you'll recall, at various points, Nasrallah personally did a name check on the U.S. negotiator. It was a bit intimidating, but Amos kept on going. I guess my belief is that Nasrallah began to hear from other Lebanese political leaders who basically said, "Really? Can you just let us get this thing done?" All I can say is that the tone went down, and he essentially said overtly, explicitly, this is a deal for Lebanon's political leaders to make, for them to judge whether it's in the interests. But in that sense, he indicated that Hezbollah would not stand in the way, but there was no discussion between the U.S. and Hezbollah.
Thank you for that statement. And continuing on the question of Hezbollah, I received a question here. Hezbollah joined the Mexican drug cartels, it's alleged, in trafficking fentanyl through the southern U.S. border, and that they're obviously getting income from that source. And again, it's alleged here that perhaps access to the oil and gas money if it comes through. So how are we preparing to deal with a Hezbollah that may be even more self-sufficient financially and active around the world? I would say some of this is an old question going back to the 90s when the FBI first started to see and act against Hezbollah's fundraising activities.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you've already answered it. It's a full-time law enforcement and intelligence piece of work. That's what it is.
Mm-hmm. And we're very committed to that, I know.
Absolutely. And
you touched several times on the Jordan deal on electricity, but the question is whether you can elaborate on the status of the deal. Are we near seeing it?
So, kind of yes and no. I mean, it's taken really, an uncomfortably long period of time for this to come to fruition. I mean, it's not simple, but there were various moving parts. So, the essential outlines of the deal of Egypt transships natural gas to Jordan. Jordan transships through the Arab pipeline through Syria, and Syria gets a small in-kind, payment, not payment in cash, but an in-kind transit fee, if you will. And then Lebanon is the recipient. But there were a series of deals that had to be inked between Lebanon and Syria, Lebanon and Jordan, Lebanon and Egypt, and so on. And then the deal itself had to be put through review by the World Bank. So, and then at the end, when the World Bank has assessed that it can provide the loan, then it will be transferred over for review by the Treasury Department. Now, essentially, one of the key pieces is that, again, this goes to electricity sector reform, which is the electricity sector has to be able to show, or the government has to be able to show, that it will generate the fees to repay the loan over time. And it also has to set up a regulatory board, again, to provide transparency. So there are some sticky pieces that are not done. It's sort of nearly done, but not there.
Well, let's hope for quick progress. I can tell from this question that someone thinks we should be doing more to push. The question is, can the U.S. work more proactively to push the reforms needed, Lebanese reforms needed to implement support from the IMF?
We are, every day. We have an extraordinarily good and active and engaged ambassador and diplomatic team on the ground. They work hand in hand with a series of other like-minded diplomatic partners. So we're all over this stuff and all over the Lebanese politicians whose job it is to get this done.
I would add, I mean, there have been so many studies, we funded many of them actually, about what kind of reforms are needed. I don't think there's an absence of knowledge of what's needed. It's an absence of will.
That's right.
Political
That's
will.
right.
And the last question I have is, does the U.S. collaborate with other international organizations and other countries to support Lebanon? And maybe you could elaborate on that. I know there's a Friends group. I know we talk a lot with the French.
Yeah, I mean, the Saudis and the French have been sort of our go-to partners as two countries that are particularly interested in coordinating policy. We do informal coordination with other countries, the UK and others. There's not a structure as such, but there's very regular multilateral work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know, Brooke, are there any more questions that we should be anticipating? Are we running out of time, or we're doing well?
Swim there.
Amal Moudallali, Lebanese former ambassador to the UN.
Yes.
Okay. Well, you touched on the Lebanese Army and the ISF as important institutions. We've invested a great deal in them. Are we going to continue that in this current way, or are we looking at new programs?
So look, I mean, as I noted earlier, we regard the Lebanese armed forces and the internal security forces as pillars of more than just immediate law and order. I mean, they were critical to assistance during and after the aftermath of the port blast. They were doing all sorts of public service work during the pandemic, and of course they are critical to internal security. So we have replenished, if you will, the metaphorical coffers with in-kind assistance, excess defense articles, food. I mean, we've given food supplies, as have a whole host of other countries, and then of course we're moving shortly to doing the direct salary payments. We never do direct salary payments. I mean, this is an extraordinary thing for extraordinary times. And of course, it's not something that a foreign government can or should do indefinitely. That is a responsibility of the Parliament and the Cabinet. They do need to get to work. But these institutions are absolutely critical. So I think we have given something on the order of $3 billion to the forces since 2006. They are sturdy, dependable partners for us. They've done great work for the Lebanese people, so yeah, we're committed.
That's good news. Although I would note that I was just reading Prime Minister designate Netanyahu's memoirs have just come out, and he mentioned there that, of course, the reason that the United States supports the Lebanese army is to implement 1701, which unfortunately is sadly absent. Yeah. So we have a question. We have a new political reality in Israel, picking up on the last point after the elections, with the right using religious parties are heading into the government, how would a new Israeli government affect the Maritime Agreement? In other words, do you think this new government's going to walk away from it?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully not. Hopefully not. And I mean, I saw that Prime Minister designate Netanyahu had said if he was elected, he was going to reject it. We'll see. We'll see. I think there will be lots of voices advising him otherwise. It's good for Israel.
It surely is. I think we're going to wrap it up here, but thank you very much.
One more?
Okay. I'm sorry if I missed it. Why don't you go ahead?
Good.
Lebanon has a physical defense and a mechanism through plethora to deconflict or avoid any accidents between Hezbollah and Israel. As far as the maritime agreement now, I mean, what can we do to actually secure it? Can we deploy some ISR capabilities? Can we work with the Lebanese Navy? I mean, now that we have it, we have to secure it.
Oh, security of the maritime boundary? Yeah, I mean, that's a level of technical detail that I'm frankly not, read into. I know that there were, discussions about how, on both sides about their commitments, what they would do. So I don't know yet whether it's necessary for a third party to do anything. Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara.
You're welcome.
Thank you all.